Hi everyone, and welcome to this session, session 4 of ACUADS DDCA conference on the topic of local and global COVID networks. This is part A of a two-part session. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations here on Wurundjeri country in the land now known as Carlton in Victoria. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And acknowledge that you're joining from different lands across this country and indeed potentially around the world as well, and acknowledge First Nations people on the lands you're joining from, and also to welcome any First Nations people who might be here today. Recognise this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Dr. Drew Pettifer. I'm a lecturer at RMIT University. I'm chairing these sessions today. Just a bit of housekeeping. If possible, you could keep your mics and cameras off just to save some bandwidth when you're not presenting or speaking. That would be great. We have 4 speakers today speaking for approximately 15 minutes each, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you'd like to pose your questions in the chat while speakers are speaking, feel free, and we'll pick them up at the end. As I said, we'll try to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for discussion. So our speakers today are in order. So first up we have Diana Chester, who will be followed by Harrison C. Then we have David Mesa, Gianni, Renda and Simon Cook. And then the final session is myself, Drew Pettifer, and Jaffa Lamb. So I'll hand it over to you, Diana.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just pull up my presentation here. All right, hopefully everybody can see that. So thanks so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about a research project that started just before the pandemic began and ended up completely shifting form and changing direction as a result of the pandemic. The presentation today, Creatively Processing the Pandemic, is all about the sonification of COVID-19 data. So I'm at the University of Sydney, and I am working with a project team there made up of my collaborators listed down below. It's Dr. Benjamin Carey, Mr. Liam Bray, and Dr. Luke Hespenhall. And we're all at USyd in different faculties, and we came together around a nanoscience project. So as artists and designers, we were proposing doing a project looking at nanoscience data and developing visualizations and sonifications of that data. And ultimately, the pandemic hit about a month after we got this funding, and we weren't able to easily work with our nano research collaborators. So you can see up here at the top of the slide, our initial mission was to develop creative interpretations of scientific data derived from nano research through visualization and sonification. We wanted to enable innovative and creative ways of expressing that data, bringing new ways for scientists to think about their research, and cultivating new inter- and interdisciplinary research methods for artists and scientists to work together. And very quickly, it became clear that as we went into lockdown in Sydney, which is where our team is based, and everything moved remotely from the university, it was definitely not going to be easy to collaborate across faculties and with researchers that we were newly acquainted. So we pivoted our focus, and like many people, I think we were very kind of focused on tracking what was going on with the emerging at that point pandemic. And so you can see here on the left, that might be a familiar map to many of you, the Johns Hopkins online COVID-19 cases map. And the data from the Hopkins map was made publicly available to people, which is really nice. So we decided to pivot our research approach, and instead of working with nanoscientists, we worked with this open source data set from the pandemic. It was easily accessible, so we could access it, and it meant that we could start working on something that felt relevant. We also all had to work in isolation of each other, which of course wasn't the plan. So the pandemic shifted our research focus, became about the COVID-19 data set. And what we ended up doing was parsing through that data set from a fixed period of time So we take a few months of data from the Johns Hopkins data set, and we would parse through that and figure out how we could reinterpret that data so that it could be expressed using musical instrument digital interface language and control voltage. And as a group of musicians and composers, those are two languages that spoke to the instrumentation that we were working with. We ran experiments in sonifying the pandemic and the new output formats from the new output forms that we were trying to develop from that data. Going into this, I would say that our kind of research goals and collaboration goals were one thing, and we ended up, of course, those ended up evolving, and we ended up shifting our goals quite dramatically. So originally, we kind of decided that each of us had this home in terms of disciplinary work, in terms of the tools that we used, in terms of where we published, and we wanted to figure out how to bring those together, how to find really interesting synergies and intersections, and how those threads could speak to new methods that we could develop. But as we ended up having all of our research collaborations on Zoom, our creative dynamics became disrupted. We, I think, only ever had one in-person meeting in the last year and a half period. And our focus personally, I think, became a preoccupation of our creative process. So our focus, our focuses as a team, I think we'd start each meeting and we'd touch in with each other and realize, wow, you know, I'm really lonely and feeling very isolated from my family because I come from a different country, right? Or somebody else was feeling like there was this real anxiety going on for them in terms of following everything that's evolving in the world. And I'm sure we can all relate to this on our own levels. I think these preoccupations around tactility, a lack of tactility, around isolation, around anxiety, loneliness, constantly changing plans, never being able to pin something down because it may shift or change, that those things began to kind of make their way into our own creative practices in this project. So with the COVID-19 data set, what we decided to do was ask, how can we sonify this scientific data? How can we sonically express this? And to answer that question, we took the data set, we parsed it into a CSV file where the data, the numerical information, took the form that could be easily translated into MIDI and control voltage information. To do that, we used a visual programming language called Max, or Max MSP, as it used to be called. On the left, the image that you see there, that's the Max MSP patch. It's a small computer program that took the information from the CSV file and allowed us to control certain parameters of it to then output it into a sound program. The image on the right, that's a screen grab from Ableton Live, which is a digital audio workstation. And at the very bottom here is the patch, the Max patch embedded in Ableton Live. And I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but what this allows us to do is pick a CSV file to read and then decide what country. And there's a drop-down menu of countries. This one is selected for Australia. And then choose the tempo and the output range for the data within that particular country's data set. And that is something that allowed us to transform the data into sound. So as we kind of worked through this process and started to develop a workflow for what we wanted to do, we started thinking more creatively. So as musicians and composers, what did we actually want to express and communicate? So we were curious how changes in the COVID cases, or the curves that we all had been hearing about at that time, how those changes over time in a particular place could be correlated to music made through changes in voltage used in a modular synthesizer, which is the image on the left-hand side of the screen, and could be correlated to MIDI notation. So actual notes that were generated from the data, which could then be sounded through virtual instruments. And for those of you who are familiar with MIDI and control voltage and modular synthesizers and virtual instruments, this probably all makes sense. For those of you who may not be as much so, I've taken some audio samples of the work that we created just to give you an idea. So the first one is the modular synthesizer. I'll just go ahead and play this. This is, again, COVID data turned into control voltage ranges from 0 to 5 volts and outputted through a modular synthesizer. And the second clip I'll play is of MIDI notes that are being generated from the CSV file, being played through a Hacken Continuum, which is this instrument you see here with a neoprene surface that has lines that mimic a piano, essentially. But instead of anyone playing it, these sounds are being fed into the instrument and using its internal sound generation and virtual instruments to then play those sounds out. So this is the MIDI soundscape. So those are the two kind of computer-generated or computer-supported, technologically supported ways of turning COVID data into sound. But then we thought our collaboration has been all about this kind of distance, this lack of tactility, this concern and interest in what's going on around the world, our collaboration being over distance instead of in person in the same room where we can improvise and talk through our ideas, and of course relating experiences, right? What's going on for you? I had to go get tested. You know, this is a friend of mine somewhere else in the world is having this challenge. Something is going on, lockdowns in Melbourne, etc. And I think that this drove our conversation quite a lot. So a lot of our conversations through this collaboration ended up becoming about these key ideas. And a part of the soundscape that we ended up generating became about the newsreels of the pandemic, the actual television and radio news reports about what was going on around the world. And so we developed a composed soundtrack of news reports from around the world, and this became a connective tissue for an essay that we put together at the end of this research project that utilized all of these sonic outputs, utilized Zoom recordings of our collaborative meetings and sessions. So we recorded them and cut up pieces of the conversation where we were talking about ideas, and then used this newsreel as sort of an underbelly or a sound floor to bring some of these ideas together. Let's play a little bit of this for you as well.
South Korea is the first country outside of China to report a suspected case. Preventive measures have been stepped up across Asia, including the introduction of airport temperature screening. And Olivia Song tells us more from Beijing.
The outbreak of mystery pneumonia cases in Wuhan began last month, and on Thursday, Chinese researchers said investigations showed a new type of coronavirus was to blame. State media reported that experts had successfully obtained the genetic sequence of the virus from one patient.
Health officials in China say around 14% of patients who had the coronavirus but recovered in the southern Guangdong province have tested positive for the virus again, and the same phenomena has been reported in Japan. Officials in both countries have said they're still learning about this new virus.
Okay, I'll pause it there. So we had these three different elements, right? These kind of conversations over Zoom, this newsreel we had created, and these sonifications of the data. And I think that what we realized is that we started with this interest in developing new methods, and we started with this interest in kind of expressing data in sonic form and visual form. It obviously became just about sound over the pandemic, and the new methods, I think we still ended up developing some new ideas around how to work together. But a lot of our work ended up becoming about how we could use sort of our own intuitive response to what was going on around us and in the world and through the pandemic without being in person with other collaborators to talk through those ideas and to inform something that became a creative expressive output. And that is what we called this audio essay. And so what we did was ultimately we developed a series of multimedia outputs, and these outputs were using the sounds that I've just shared with you, as well as short essays that we had written about the work. And in the last minute here, I'll just play for you a piece of this new composition. It's not out yet, this audio essay as we're calling it, but it will be coming out in Echo Journal, which is a new multimedia journal through the Orpheus Institute.
The thing is about the use of the COVID-19 data is that it's so situated in where we are right now. It wasn't just a pragmatic choice, it also had resonance, and there was a reason for that resonance. And I think as well that that's a useful thing to think of when we're talking about any data, about why this particular data set is useful.
The Nano Resonance project began with us talking about ways of exploring our own artistic research methodologies while working with scientists and with scientific data sets. And that's what got us excited. And then there was the pandemic. And I think the project could have Mr. Lambre.
Ever since the pandemic began, couldn't help but think of the way that our behavior has changed. And that this virus has a behavior of its own. And that behavior has been imposed upon us and changed the way that we're living our day-to-day lives.
The concept of the tactile and of touch has been so present for me during this time. I'm creatively filling that emotional gap with the desire and need for there to be a tactility to this work. We've talked about using reel-to-reel and other tape mediums to have there be a physical, temporal, but also distance-oriented orientation to the movement of information and data so that we could run tape between areas of that space. And the temporality of the way that the composition flows becomes impacted by the distance.
Thanks, Diana. That's 15, just to let you know.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So just to give you a little bit of an example about this kind of final output process. So I think kind of just to wrap up, what I'd say is this is to kind of give you a sense of this project that was created through the pandemic, these collaborations that happened, but also one of the things that I'm excited about is that there are these new kind of journals that are emerging like Echo that are trying to be able to bring more work into a multimedia format. We've seen it with exhibitions and performances through the pandemic, but I think this is kind of an interesting, exciting outcome for somebody working in multimedia arts to be able to share more work, sometimes in a peer-reviewed environment, sometimes not, but to put it out there in ways that can kind of be more inclusive of the dynamic layers of the work that is happening. So that's all from me. There's my contact info, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Diana. That was great. Really great to hear and encounter some artwork during presentations. Next up, we have Harrison C. Harrison. Yes. There we
I have
go.
a microphone. Can everyone see me? Yep.
Yes. Okay. And we can see your presentation.
Great. Okay. Yeah, so hi everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Harrison C. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the school, at Edith Cowan University rather, in the School of Arts and Humanities, where I'm undertaking a practice-led research into cross-cultural collaboration with a focus on approaches to collaborative painting. Today I'm presenting my paper, Sustained Connection Through Material Dialogue, International Collaborative Painting During the COVID-19 Pandemic, and with it, briefly sharing some of my experiences from this ongoing research, specifically how physical postage was utilized as an alternative to online platforms to maintain international contact during a time of physical disconnection and screen fatigue. Before I start, it's important to note that I began this research in 2019 with a predefined face-to-face model of dialogic collaboration. I proposed to collaborate with artists in Southeast Asia through a combination of residency programs and studio visits that were organized through connections I established when once living in that region. These face-to-face collaborations would be shared in-person studio sessions where we would observe, inquire, and reciprocate each other's utterances as we worked. I did get the opportunity to collaborate in this way locally, both in between and after lockdown periods. However, today I will instead be talking about how my methods were adapted to maintain my inquiry into the material practice of paint, despite international border restrictions. My research is through the practice of dialogic collaboration, predominantly informed by a synthesis of ideas between Mikhail Bakhtin and Charles Green. Collaborations are understood as an exchange of reciprocated utterances, where meaning is negotiated and transformed intersubjectively. In this case, meaning was negotiated across verbal, written, and most importantly, material utterances. Being dialogic, these collaborations acknowledge the plurality of meaning, do not require consensus nor compromise, and embrace difference as a requirement for any dialogue. Although power dynamics are always inevitable, collaboration is never co-option, and this process inherently decentralizes the self, a shift in agency from the individual to the composite. This shift can create a third artistic identity, or hand, as Green puts it, superimposed over and exceeding the individual artists themselves. To quote Green, collaboration is not simply the sum of two parts. Today I'll focus on two of my international collaborators. The first, an artist I met while living in Shanghai, Zhong Yiqiao, or Joey, a Henan-born Chinese national studying in UK across London's strictest lockdown periods. And the second, an artist I've still never met in person, but who I would have been working with through one of my now cancelled residencies, Liu Wanting, or Rita, living in Kowloon during the Hong Kong protests. Both Rita and Joey were inhabiting spaces much more disrupted than mine, disruptions which from Perth often feel like a world away. Yet these two projects endured over months as we posted back and forth a series of collaborative paintings and studies. These exchanges were not drawn out over months just due to the increased congestion of postal services, but because of the disruption each of us personally faced given our locations. And again, I acknowledge my experiences of disruption were the least by far. Although the projects with Joey and Rita were very much separate, they overlapped chronologically, forming links as I responded to them from my studio back in Perth. To provide a greater sense of context, my collaborations with Joey and Rita were part of a much larger group of ongoing collaborative connections, all fragmented across my studio at any one time as I moved back and forth between over a dozen projects. Why use post? Both Joey and Rita were more than competent with a variety of creative software, while I have years of experience across digital media through a long-standing design practice. All of us had access to many online platforms that facilitate simultaneous video chat, screen sharing, and editing functions. So in a way, we could have still observed, inquired, and reciprocated each other's utterances as we worked. However, even during the relatively modest periods of COVID disruption here in Perth, I witnessed many parts of my life shift online. And I know myself and many members within my community of practice were frustrated with screen fatigue. Most importantly, however, as an oil painter, I value the unique material language of painting, a language I stubbornly hope to preserve in spite of an increased reliance on Zoom meetings and share folders, a language that has been declared dead multiple times throughout history. Insisting on using postal services did bring with it limitations on cost, size, and materials, and of course, an inherent lag ranging from weeks to months between responses. This lag was unfamiliar to all three of us, as we had grown up under the ubiquity of email, never before needing to rely on post to communicate. It is important to note that during both of these projects, each series of artworks was sent back and forth in its entirety. Yet there were no expectations to respond to all or any of the pieces, and each artist knew they could respond in any way they felt, as long as the outcome could fit back into the original packaging. Although far less common when compared to the influx of collaborative art that grew out of postmodernism, more often than not performance or video works, collaboration via postage is still nothing new. The 1999 book, I Send You This Cadmium Red, documents the long-term postal correspondence by John Berger and John Christie. While in 2010, Carol Archer exhibited a whole series of post-based works created while living in Hong Kong with 5 other artists from all over the world. More recently and closer to home, Noongar artist Sandra Hill and Chinese painter Gao Shuyong created a much larger one-off painting for NAIDOC Week between Perth and Shanghai. While the book Framing Conflict details the exchange of a series of multidisciplinary artworks between Charles Green himself, his partner and longtime collaborator Lyndall Brown, and their contemporary John Catapan. Among others, these 4 examples of collaborative practice helped expand my thinking beyond my original face-to-face model. Inspired to adapt my approaches, I always began with a quiet utterance, not wanting to resolve anything too quickly, allowing us to get a feel for our positions as speakers through a negotiation of meaning. I already knew that Joey had an illustration practice that rendered dream-like children's stories. One of the first utterances I sent can be seen here on the left, and I hoped it would be understood as an invitation to respond rather than an instruction. This material dialogue was negotiated over months and several return journeys between London and Perth, eventually developing into the small study on the right. In this way, Joey and I fleshed out many whimsical characters, places, and backstories, one material utterance at a time. Responses were not instantaneous, and these smaller studies often sat on my desk for weeks before I ever made a mark. It was in between other tasks that I would handle them, deliberating how I wanted to respond, deliberating what might add value to our conversation. When it came time to draw or paint, this deliberation was then negotiated through the material language of each piece. When it came to my collaboration with Rita, I had not seen any of her artworks before this project, so I made a point to remain ignorant until after our material dialogue had begun. Then I soon discovered she had a studio mural painting practice, focusing on tree-filled urban landscapes within Hong Kong. On the left, Rita painted a view from the street of her studio, a view out towards Lion Rock, an icon for Hong Kong locals that became important to her during the protests. On the right was my response. It was an unusually rainy day for Perth, so I spent some time layering drips and washes before rendering swans and riverbanks, eventually painting the shape of Perth's Swan River into the grey sky, a reciprocation of my own local iconography. Here I was Here I was responding in a moment of time and space different to that of Rita's. 2 moments separated by many weeks and thousands of kilometers, but connected through painting and the shared handling of materials. Like Joey, these moments were also strung together across many months, deepening my connection to my collaborator's space and hopefully theirs to mine. At times, responses took the form of written utterances. This allowed the meaning of imagery to be further negotiated through a combination of English as well as simplified and traditional Chinese characters. A similar combination also appeared on the backs as well. Due to my limited ability to read simplified Chinese and my lack of familiarity altogether with traditional Chinese, having lived in Shanghai, these handwritten utterances took a long time to interpret, decode, and ultimately respond to. If I didn't recognize characters, I would redraw them one by one in the translator app Pleco, which can be seen on the right in a screenshot. Instead of just copying and pasting entire blocks of text into Google Translate, this handwritten approach turned dialogue into a slow unraveling, a process that demanded I pay a much greater attention to the qualities of these utterances as I attempted to decode them. From a creativity perspective, this slow process also led to some interesting responses emerging through a combination of mistranslation, misinterpretation, and me impatiently trying to anticipate what a message might have said before decoding it in full. Even documenting utterances became part of our greater dialogues. On the left, being an annotated photograph of my studio, me trying to share my process with Rita that for the most part had remained unseen by her. While on the right is a screenshot of my phone camera engaging face detection as I attempted to document Joey's responses. Both were sent along with the paintings themselves, inviting additional layers of dialogue that might express, contextualize, or inspire our main utterances. When I say main utterances, this is not to devalue the contributions of other mediums, but rather to ensure that dialogue focused on the material languages we were trying to preserve. Both collaborators and myself could have easily used our phones to send back and forth photos as we worked. Although we mostly avoided this practice, not just because we enjoyed the surprise of unpacking each other's responses, but because I did not want to risk an exchange where paintings were experienced through the types of knowledge privileged by digital imagery. In other words, I did not want to risk experiencing a painting more through its representation than through that painting itself. Beyond this, there did exist exchanges over messenger apps, but this was reserved for pleasantries and logistical information. As I increasingly relied on online platforms across other parts of my research, the sending and receiving of artifacts that had been physically handled by my collaborators became an important counterstance. Artifacts that not only recorded their creation, but captured their handling became treasured. As I responded to these paintings through my own handling, I would inevitably discover another's imprints, stroke pressures, smudges, creases, and tears, along with the qualities of our paints, pencils, canvases, and paper. Material records that cannot be backed up or replicated digitally. These records could have vanished amongst the unimaginable constellations of international freight that is sent and received each day. And because of all the time and energy invested in these types of exchanges, I often joked with my collaborators that sending a painting felt like smuggling contraband across borders. Here you can see some of the paintings I created with Rita pinned up in each of our studios 6,000 kilometers apart. Knowing that these paintings existed between two spaces that we could not, created a greater sense of connection when compared to the ubiquity and convenience of online communication. A ubiquity and convenience that, in contrast, made our exchanges seem like antiquated and unnecessarily challenging pursuits. During this time, both collaborators and myself all navigated our other ongoing projects, studies, and professional obligations. Here, our collaboration sat in contrast, having no fixed timelines or quotas. This way of working not only invited serendipity, but invited a shift in how I conceived my relationship with time and productivity. Multiple artists negotiating multiple artworks across multiple times and spaces made working along a singular linear timeline impossible. Perhaps most importantly, unlike all the exchanges that I carry around on my phone at all times, these postage-based collaborations force periods of dormancy. While in transit, dormant projects were never inert, as the evidence of my time working with them was scattered around my studio. Rather, I thought of this separation, this dormancy, as forced periods of rest. Maintaining projects where the access and frequency of responses was completely out of my control meant these collaborations had to exist beyond my everyday deadlines. A lack of control that created a series of moments beyond the expectations of productivity championed by online communication platforms. A series of moments reserved for the shared handling of materials by individuals half a world away. Adapting to this way of collaborating has kept me connected in ways that sit in contrast to the online experience. A connection across borders that privileges material handling, not rapid-fire responses. A connection that captured moments within a series of artifacts and shares them across continents. Okay. Thank you. That's it from me.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Harrison. And next up, we have David Mesa, Gianni Renda, and Simon Cook. David and Gianni, I think you're presenting. Perfect, we can see.
Yep. Yeah, I will be presenting on Simon and Gianni's behalf as well. They're here, but I'm going to be giving the presentation. So we're going to share with you a case study of a university and industry collaboration, and we're going to explain how we leverage design thinking remotely in this context. So Gianni and I work at Swinburne and lecture product design, and then Simon is one of the co-founder of Udemon Technologies, or is currently the CTO. I'm going to start explaining you a little bit of the context. So Udemon Technologies is a company that is based in Sydney. They do manufacturing focused on sexual and reproductive health. So they combine material sciences expertise and advanced manufacturing techniques. Then Gianni has done research about the value of product design in health and medtech. And I'm a product design engineer with experience in product development, and I'm also researching how to develop and commercialize university technology. So we have been in conversations before. Gianni had collaborated with Udemon in the past for a long time, and I wanted to engage with them, but because of the context of my research, I was interested in Udemon, and we had been in touch. So we saw APR intern, the APR intern program, as a really good opportunity for engaging. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but basically, it's an internship program for PhD students in Australia to work in Australian companies. So the government supports with some funding that it's part of the salary of the PhD students. So these projects are usually between 3 to 6 months. In our case, the collaboration took 6 months. And the way we did it is that I was having weekly meetings with Gianni to check the progress and to ideate together. As designers, we really appreciate teamwork and having other people looking at your work. And we also had every 2 weeks meetings with Robert and Simon from Udemon Technologies. So Robert Gorking is the CEO. And we would just report through Zoom's, Google Meet, or Teams, because this all happened at the start of this year. The project is started. And we would do it through presentations and reports. So at the start, to tell you a little bit about the project, we were looking at what were commercial available Internet of Things solutions and how they could be utilized to support and refine the manufacturing processes at Udemon Technologies. In other words, they have a really advanced manufacturing facility in Sydney that could do a lot of things that we're not currently doing. For example, they had a lot of sensors controlling every part of the manufacturing process, but they didn't have the analysis capability for automating, like retrieving that information in real time and facilitating the analysis. So because it's still quite experimental and there are many variables, like it's important to learn as much as you can from the process. So we wanted to see what was out there. So that was the first objective. What are the tools? What is Industry 4.0? How can it actually benefit the production? Then the second objective was starting to narrow the search a little bit and define what we need to buy, or what are the requirements of the systems, how can we actually start implementing them. The third objective would be more specific into looking what we actually need for creating a dashboard. A dashboard is basically a visualization of the data you're collecting in real time, but sometimes it be like from past data as well. And then finally, the final objective would be try to develop a demo of one of these dashboards operating. Because Gianni and I are designers, and because Simon and Robert have collaborated with designers in the past, we kind of took this design thinking approach. We would start really broad and explore as many possibilities as we could. We tried to learn as much as we could in the first initial weeks of the project. Then we would start defining an area of focus. We would develop different prototypes, and then we would identify which one was the one that suited Udemont Technologies' interest the most. So in the initial 4 weeks of the project, we started by doing this Industry 4.0 landscape. And because that's not our area of expertise, and Industry 4.0 is very broad, we had to look at things as Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, data monitoring and visualization, digital twins, machine learning, cloud computing, cloud storage. So this is like a whole universe of technology, and it can get quite complicated. Just to give you an idea, some of the technology platforms we were looking at, and Amazon Web Services was the first one that started offering this cloud computing capability, and Azure, that it belongs to Microsoft. Each one of these offer more than 300 products. So you go to the website and you're trying to figure out what you need to pick in order to adapt it to your manufacturing process, and it's quite overwhelming. It's actually a really difficult task. So we also look at all the systems, but we spoke with researchers at Swinburne. Swinburne has done a lot of research in the Industry 4.0. So we were talking to different experts, and also looking for local companies that were doing some type of partnerships or facilitating the implementation of these technologies. And we found something that Udemont had experienced before, is that the researchers that study Industry 4.0 have a lot of technical knowledge, but the language they speak, it doesn't connect with what the manufacturing industry really needs. So sometimes having a lot of knowledge is a disadvantage, because it's hard to show how you can practically implement those solutions for different needs of different users. So the second half of this initial semester of the project, we were focusing on objective 2 and 3. So we were defining and developing. We started looking at the 3 best candidates we had for integrating the manufacturing process and bringing it online into the cloud. And we did a test with a small device with Amazon Web Services. So I had it connected here at home. I had it connected by Wi-Fi to the internet, and from anywhere I could see what this device was sensing. So I could see the temperature, movement, if movement was detected, humidity. But to do that, I actually had to do a lot of coding, and it was a really complicated process just to do something as simple as visualizing what was happening remotely. So we said, this seems to be very powerful, but it's useful if you were a data scientist or if you actually know how to program. Otherwise, it's too complicated. Then we tested Cumulosity IoT, which has been tailored for manufacturing companies. And I was able to connect my phone and actually trigger actions from the software as well. So we could imagine how we could fit Udemont context. However, it required changing some stuff in the data management approach of the company. And also it required a monthly fee that was quite high. Another option that we look at, on the other hand, fitted Udemont process, the process they had already and the resources, and the implementation cost was quite low. Perhaps we could do less stuff with it, but we could take some really big advantages. So this is how the proof of concept prototype for Microsoft Power BI, which is the last one that I told you, looked like. So this was the first objective, right? We wanted to see how we could visualize the manufacturing data. Now, we were speaking, for example, here we have 63 different runs. And the good thing with this type of dashboards is that they're completely interactive. So you can filter, for example, by who was the operator that day. You can filter by date. You can filter by the type of experiment. So you can control the data as you want, and you can visualize that in 1 second. So we saw that we had a chat. This actually occurred in the middle of the project. So we still have 13 weeks, and we were almost done with the project. So we say, okay, how do we actually rescope this to keep moving forward? So we decided to plan a full implementation of this. We said, okay, this software, it's attractive. It doesn't have a really high implementation cost, and we can do it with the technology we have. So then after that, the last objective would be, how do we keep digitalizing the company? So how we move forward if we actually want remote control and remote monitoring. So not only analyzing the information in real time, but what if we actually want to compute to control the manufacturing plant in Sydney from Perth or from Melbourne, or from anywhere on internet. So this is how one of the final dashboard that we were doing looked like. So if you see, there's a lot of valuable information here that combining the skills of designers to visualize complex information can help. What is behind this is just thousands of rows in Excel with data from sensors from the machine, but we're being able to translate that into useful information for manufacturing. So for example, we can see different mandrels that are components of that manufacturing system and their success rate per production. Again, this all is interactive and can be filtered. And you can see by experiment how many runs there were, how many condoms were produced in this case, and all this information. Another dashboard, for example, is to compare different experiments. So imagine you have experiment 27 here, experiment 30, and you can see the difference in the success rate and the difference in the parameters. So as a production manager, you can tell straight away, okay, there's something wrong with this, right? We got a higher success rate and we only change this variable. So perhaps we need to focus on this specific aspect. Another example is controlling by mandrel. So imagine you can see the defects of the final product. You can combine that information with the variable from the manufacturing process that you were sensing. And if you look at this image very quickly, without knowing a lot about the manufacturing process or what was being produced, you can tell straight away that there was something wrong with mandrel 5. So for me, based in Melbourne, working with them based in Sydney, I was actually able to tell them, hey, we need to check what's going on with mandrel 5. And one of the operators in Sydney actually said, oh yeah, you're right, we'll look into it. And it was hitting something inside the machine. So that specific mandrel was having an issue. So this is the value that combining like visualization skills and design skills for communication can bring to these manufacturing processes. And this is how we ended up doing it inside Udemont. I'm going to go quickly into this, but because I want to jump into the conclusions. So we were using a software that collects surveys that is called FastFill. Basically, there was an operator looking into the machine. You fill information in. Once you click submit, that is sent to the internet, to the cloud. So it was collected in Google Drive. Then we were mirroring that drive into OneDrive for because that had some compatibility benefits to integrate with Microsoft Power BI. So we also had a backup of all the information. And in Power BI, what we were doing is that every information or survey that was sent was combined, compiled, and filtered. Then that was visualized in those dashboards. So we didn't have to create a dashboard every month or every week or every time. We did the job once, and now this thing is fully operating. So every time the operators hit send, the information is refreshed. So in the future, you would be able to see the information collected from years of production. So you can really take informed decisions. So this is close to real-time analysis, and basically working from here, we were planning at the beginning to go and visit them in Sydney and understand the manufacturing process, but we had to do everything through CAD modeling. So just using 3D models to be able to understand that information and the manufacturing process. And of course, supported by Microsoft Teams and Google Meet. So some of the important findings that we got is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution for digitalizing manufacturing processes. So there needs to be more research explaining a practical way to start implementing this step by step, and not trying to jump from, I have an old school manufacturing process and I want to have the most advanced manufacturing plant, right? That will cost millions of dollars. So another opportunity is that this perhaps could be one of the futures of industrial design and product design engineer, perhaps graphic design as well, is that we need to exploit that ability to communicate and visualize complex information, because it will play an important role in the digitalization of manufacturing companies. So we need to be that bridge between different disciplines, and we need to facilitate the user experience and the usability. I want to highlight, of course, as well, the benefits of using the APR internship program. So if you know a company that you can collaborate with, this is a really good option. So keep that in mind. If you haven't used it, go to their website and have a look. And I want to finish by saying that the future is changing, technology is changing, and if there's something we're good at as designers, is adapting. We're changing the projects we're working on all the time. We also need to change the way we work. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And again, perfect 15 minutes. Thank you. Great. So I'm presenting our final session for this session, final presentation. So I'll just share my screen. Just want to confirm that's in presenter mode. Yes, great. Okay, so this paper will examine a series of innovations and adjustments that have been applied to the joint delivery of RMIT University's Bachelor of Arts Fine Art program, which is offered in partnership with the Hong Kong Art School. And these adaptations have been made in response to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also they've been complicated by the social situation in Hong Kong as well. This paper has been co-authored with Jaffa, the academic head of Hong Kong Art School, but I'll be presenting on both of our behalves. So ordinarily for this program, Melbourne-based RMIT staff travel to Hong Kong twice a year to deliver face-to-face studio-intensive courses with local students in Hong Kong. But for the first time in the 23-year history of the program, international travel restrictions because of COVID-19 have prevented Australian staff from teaching in person as of July 2020. In response to these changed conditions, RMIT and Hong Kong Art School have devised a range of different strategies for maintaining and extending our global partnership within current geopolitical constraints. And this paper is intended to highlight some of the learnings made from this process so far. So RMIT has delivered collaborative fine art education with the Hong Kong Arts Centre since 1998. And the relationship proved quite productive early on. And so as of 2000, Hong Kong Arts Centre set up an arm, the Hong Kong Arts School, which is a division of Hong Kong Arts Centre. And the core focus of the partnership has been the joint delivery of a Bachelor of Arts Fine Art program, which is registered and accredited in Hong Kong, though during the relationship we've also delivered a Master of Fine Arts and are looking at other master's level programs currently. But the focus of today is on the Bachelor of Arts Fine Art adaptations. In terms of delivery, RMIT delivered 25% of the total teaching load in intensive seminars that occur just prior to the start of each semester, so in January and July of each year. And then Hong Kong Art School teach what we call regular weeks during the semester. So for the intensives, RMIT staff travel to Hong Kong for 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the course that's being delivered, which is made up of intensive face-to-face delivery, which includes studio classes, which are normally taught by 2 academic staff from RMIT, and then art, history, theory, cultures classes taught normally by 1 academic who delivers the lectures during the intensive period, and then the tutorials are delivered during regular weeks by Hong Kong Art School staff. So the rest of the courses in each course that's delivered is taught through those regular weeks for studio and for art history. And this international perspective with access to academics and practitioners from Australia and Hong Kong has been a major drawcard for the program, particularly when many students in the program are working adults who aren't able to travel for things like exchanges. And so that international global perspective has been a key kind of marketing drawcard for the program and something they've been very keen to maintain. We were last able to deliver face-to-face in January 2020. This is Dr. Renda Costa from RMIT presenting during the orientation seminar for that period. And it was towards the end of that stay, while we were in Hong Kong, actually, that RMIT travel notifications started to identify a virus in China as a potential travel risk. We returned home shortly thereafter and obviously had major impacts globally, including on Melbourne campuses and other Australian campuses. Now, given that teaching is the core of the partnership, it's no surprise that initially our primary focus was on alternative delivery models to ensure that there was continuity in the delivery of the program itself. And like many art schools teaching during the pandemic, we pivoted to concurrent delivery for that July 2020 intensive and have used that methodology for all of our intensive teaching since that time. And indeed, January 2022 will again be delivered in that format, and July 2022 will be reassessed as global travel resumes. Hong Kong do have quite restrictive travel restrictions given their zero COVID approach currently, that will pose an ongoing challenge for delivery and affect when we can return. So RMIT staff began online delivery for onshore teaching as of March 2020, as did many campuses in Australia. So had developed some teaching strategies for this alternative format by the time our teaching came around for the intensive. Art, history, theory, cultures maintained a single staff model with online lectures delivered by RMIT staff during the intensive, and then the tutorials remained Hong Kong Art School staff delivering face-to-face in regular weeks. Again, this is a fairly common live online concurrent teaching model for that component. For studio classes, however, since Hong Kong only had very short periods of lockdown and continued face-to-face delivery for most of the period, we're able to devise a blended concurrent delivery model for studio classes. So we engaged 1 Hong Kong Art School staff member for each studio intensive. These were usually sessional staff members, so differed to the core teaching staff in each regular week's course, meaning that students had different teaching experiences. And Hong Kong staff delivered face-to-face with students live in the space, while an RMIT staff member would join the classes online. We used our learning management system, Canvas, to allow RMIT staff to join the session, along with other students who might have been, for example, having to isolate or otherwise unable to attend the class in person. And interestingly, what this led to as well is that students in the live face-to-face teaching space would sometimes also join the session on their mobile device as well, allowing them to use their camera to show different perspectives, for example, of artworks that we might be discussing at the time, and to read the online chat, and even just to hear the online discussion better when the staff member or students online made comments. And we recognise, that precise definitions for terms like blended and hybrid and flipped and concurrent do remain ambiguous. So we use these terms as follows. So when it comes to blended delivery, we follow Graham and Zuban's approach of a learning environment that combines face-to-face instruction with technology-mediated instruction. So we're talking about simultaneous delivery with students, as I've kind of discussed the structure. So students and staff in a blend of face-to-face and online at the same time is where the concurrent comes in. And not only did this delivery model facilitate program delivery during a global pandemic, which impacted delivery. It also led to some critical cross-cultural shared pedagogies through this co-teaching model, which I'll go into in just a moment as well. These were extended as a result of a specific project that we implemented earlier this year as a means of cross-cultural student exchange and engagement in the absence of global mobility. And this collaborative online international learning, or COIL project, saw students enrolled in the capstone studio class at each campus, so second semester of third year, participate in an online gallery, discussion boards, and a series of joint studio critique sessions. And so the premise of COIL is to foster the development of intercultural competence skills for students, to create global citizens, work-ready graduates. It's a common process that existed pre-pandemic, but took on a new importance during the pandemic. Globalization, it's certainly been argued, has increased the need for creative practitioners to be capable of operating in cross-cultural environments, and experiential learning like this has been identified as one of the best ways to develop those kind of competencies. And so in the absence of international exchange opportunities, for example, as a result of COVID, this COIL met a critical need that otherwise was also absent. And COIL is also arguably a more equitable vehicle for international exchange. It's more accessible, it's less costly and more democratic in terms of participation than traditional student exchanges. So we had 205 students enrolled in the project across both campuses. It was a voluntary learning activity for students in that studio. And so around 20% of students actively engaged in the activities, posting images of their work, participating in discussions around other students' work and their own, and joining the live studio critique sessions. We also had 33 academic staff teaching into third year across both campuses, who would also engage in the discussions around the works posted on the discussion boards and participate in the crit sessions. And in fact, the crit sessions are a particular side of exchange. 5 students presented their work live on campus in Hong Kong, with staff and students from RMIT joining the 2-hour discussion online. And then the following week, 5 students from Melbourne presented their work either on campus in their studio spaces if they had exemptions to attend campus, or online. And again, other staff and students from both institutions joined online to engage in the discussion. And you can see 2 works that was presented here. The diversity of approaches to teaching and feedback and the different pedagogies that emerged between Australian and Hong Kong staff exposed staff and students to new ways of thinking about creative practice and fine art education. And it's actually proved a catalyst for more in-depth discussions around appropriate and effective pedagogical methodologies across institutions, something that hadn't really existed previously given the very separate and distinct delivery structures. In some ways, the COIL project was intended as a temporary substitute for our annual interlocation program. So ordinarily, several students from Hong Kong spend a semester in Melbourne and vice versa. This program was only implemented in 2019, so only ran once before the pandemic caused it to be put on hold. And this image is from a promotional material slide that Hong Kong Art School share with their students, but of course we do the same with RMIT students too. We're actually able to create an innovative approach to this program this semester by chance, where we had 2 international students from Hong Kong who'd normally study onshore in Melbourne, who were able to use the interlocational program to engage in face-to-face learning for the current semester. And given the success of the COIL project, we'll actually run both opportunities, the interlocational program and the COIL project, in future iterations. While we've been able to physically be together, we've been able to exploit new technologies and new ways of working in the age of COVID to meet more regularly with staff or among staff than we otherwise would. So using Microsoft Teams and Zoom, we found new digital ways for staff to network and share ideas across institutions that again hadn't existed previously. So I have fortnightly meetings with my Hong Kong counterparts. We have staff meetings for all staff teaching of the programs each semester. We have studio coordinator meetings each quarter. And this is, again, far more frequent than we would have had we been travelling for face-to-face meetings with occasional online in between. And staff at both institutions have also used the learning management system, Canvas, more proactively to share information and to ensure greater consistency between the different components of the teaching. And finally, as you can see in this image, we've also used new technologies to enhance our research relationships. So this is a still image of Jaffa delivering a lecture for Contemporary Art and Social Transformation, the research group CAST in RMIT School of Art, and other Hong Kong Art School staff have delivered similar research presentations. And these discussions have not only shared our research practices, but also led to new collaborative research opportunities that have already been taken up. And again, this has the potential to be further enhanced by a triangulated approach that we're taking to the relationship in its current mature phase. You can see in this screenshot from RMIT School of Art website a series of formal international relationships that the university holds with other institutions. And again, Hong Kong Art School has an impressive network to draw upon despite being a smaller institution. And so in the next phase of this relationship between RMIT and Hong Kong Art School, we're working on linking networks and research through this network as a means of mutual enhancement and benefit, with the special relationship between RMIT and Hong Kong Art School still at the centre of this networked opportunity. And again, CAST will be increasingly important in facilitating research relationships in this network. And one kind of forthcoming example of how we plan to facilitate this triangulation is through a symposium that RMIT will host online in the first half of 2022 with a range of partner institutes across the region focusing on creative practice education in a post-COVID or living with COVID world. And then finally, RMIT and Hong Kong Art School have been fortunate in being able to find alternative, innovative ways to preserve and strengthen the global partnership through a very difficult geopolitical period. For the most part, the strategic goals of the partnership haven't required major adjustment, but instead we've used a traffic light system to determine actions in the plan that are completed, in progress, or not yet started, and as a specific COVID edition, postponed. No goals in our 5-year plan have yet been missed, though a handful have been postponed, and others have just required innovative recontextualisation, such as implementing the COIL project to achieve goals around student exchange, for example. And as we resume international travel in the coming months and years, we're confident that the existing strategic plan can be delivered with some creative responses to the actions required to successfully deliver each goal. So with the pandemic, obviously it's undoubtedly caused untold disruption and challenges. Some of the innovations, adaptations and pedagogical shifts, however, that have been necessitated by the pandemic, hopefully have the potential to support and strengthen this international collaboration moving forward. And while the return of physical global mobility will definitely be welcome given the centrality of materiality and spatial practices when it comes to finite education, new approaches to digital global mobility resulting from this experience under COVID in particular could function as important ongoing enhancements to this long-standing program and relationship. And I'll leave it there and open it to questions for all of the panelists, should you have any. Have a quick look at the chat. Any questions for any of our panelists? We've got about 7 minutes till the break. If not, I might pose one to Harrison and Diana, and perhaps you can each answer it, around different modes of collaboration during the pandemic. Diana, you mentioned, for example, maybe I'll ask you first, you mentioned you had one face-to-face meeting as a group. Were there different modes, or did the different modes of collaboration create different opportunities or challenges?
Yeah, definitely lots of challenges. I think our primary mode was over Zoom, right? And we tried to build programs and share them between us digitally, and then actually create things in isolation and then share them together. That was our kind of main way of doing it. The one time we were able to meet in person, what we found was we covered so much more ground in 2 hours in person than we did in all of our conversations online. But that being said, I think that was about creative output. But when it came to actually getting at some of the elements of collaboration that maybe aren't as intuitively exposed in a traditional context, which was about, well, what are the underlying things that we bring to this right now because of everything we're experiencing in our own lives? And what are the, the factors in our everyday, the things we're reading, the things we're listening to, the things we're interested in, and the ways that those are affecting what we're what we're creating, like how can we bring that to the table and incorporate that more into what we're doing in a very transparent way with with our collaborators. I think that part was heightened. That was sort of the outcome that doesn't as often come out beyond sharing a link of a paper or a presentation when collaborating in person. So I guess there's a bit of a trade-off in that way.
Okay, interesting. And Harrison, did you want to reflect as well on the modes of collaboration under COVID? Because you worked in quite what's the word? Analog ways, I suppose, with the posting.
Yes. Yeah. Well, as I was saying in the presentation, I began this with a very particular, material practice, so analog process in mind. I think my proposal was accepted, and it was sort of in the ether of the news, people talking about COVID as this distant thing, and it was getting compared to SARS and things that never made its way to our shores. And then slowly it began more and more. But I did try online collaboration, but I really wanted to. The thing that shifted for me more was the context of where the collaborations occurred. So when I went in, I was going to travel to Southeast Asia, negotiate that East versus West problematic binary that exists everywhere. But instead, even though I've still collaborated with two of the people I set up to, it's now shifted to looking at cultural spaces within Perth, which, similar to the eastern states, has quite a high sort of rate of diversity in those cultural heritages anyway. So it wasn't really the methods that changed, as Perth didn't have as bad a lockdown as other states. So it was a matter of just waiting till I could have access to my collaborators again, and then planning in between that. And then luckily now we haven't had a proper lockdown for quite a while. But it was more the narrative of looking at cultural spaces within Perth and hybridity rather than me going overseas. So if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. And I guess that also shifts a little bit how you collaborated with your collaborators, given that mobility as well.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Were there any other questions for our presenters?
Just a couple of questions in the chat.
Drew, I think Kit put something in. It's Denise. Drew, hi. I was just wondering about the dynamic of bringing students the other way. I mean, I realise the implications of that, and I suppose it in a way connects with what Kit's saying also. The different energies or different found in different places and locations. I think it kind of connects with his question. Yeah, I don't know if you can read those in the chat. It's pretty hard to read and answer, isn't it?
It is, but I'm just reading them as you speak.
Yeah, so it's really about that peer learning, I suppose, and peer learning in different locale, in different speeds, in different expectations. I mean, I've taught a bit in China, and it is really quite interesting, the different levels of expectations and negotiations, just because places are different. Actually, it's not even necessarily cultural, frankly. Anyway, yeah.
I agree. Yeah, no, so there are definitely different modes of working and different, as there are among creative practitioners in general, but I think there are things that have emerged having taught into Hong Kong. I've been teaching there for about 8 years now, and just seeing those different dynamics that function. And we've also noticed through the interlocational program, the students from Hong Kong who came to Melbourne in that one iteration we've actually had were really, what's the word? They were really, they stepped away with an experience which took them back to Hong Kong with a renewed vigor and a different approach with that. They also shared with other students there. There's different, I mean, Kit refers to as different energies of work. And I think they came back with a renewed energy around their practice when they came back to Hong Kong from that experience. But the opportunity to learn together in that COIL project was really incredible to see, not just for students, but also for staff, where they were learning around each other around, as Kit mentions, pace and ambition. But even just the approach to practice and how we function in terms of our pedagogies in a crit session were very different. You know, we have different cultural expectations around, you know, how we communicate in those spaces, which was really, I mean, Jaffa noticed in the preparation for this paper that they seem to be much more direct and critical than we are in our approaches at RMIT, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question. So we've actually hit 2 o'clock, so I might suggest we wind up the panel there. Thank you to all of the presenters, and we will see you all in the next sessions, which I believe start at 2:30.